Welcome back, dear traveler. In the previous leg of our expedition, we descended upon the formerly beautiful planet of Meridia, where we managed to locate several impressive Terminid specimens. After a brief intermission, we've begun to descend once again, in search of even more of these fascinating insectoid creatures. And in case you've somehow forgotten, allow me to reintroduce myself. I am Dr. Felix Nebula, and you are traveling aboard the dimension-hopping bioship Manta. Oh, and just as a matter of housekeeping, let me remind you that your discretion is appreciated. We may not be bound by the regulations of this dimension, but let's just say that the government of Super Earth can be a real pain in the...
Democracy?
Close enough.
Descent complete. Re-engaging perimeter scans.
Excellent, thank you, Manta. Now, as we search for another fascinating specimen to observe directly, allow me to elaborate upon one aspect of Terminid biology we have yet to cover. You may notice, dear traveler, that the planet we see around us is quite desolate, even barren. And yet, as we've seen, Terminids thrive not only here, but in nearly every environment they find themselves in. Why? Well, in part, it's because they have the ability to regulate their body temperature in a way that is neither cold-blooded nor warm-blooded, but in fact a fascinating combination of the two, a physiological trait known as heterothermy. Now, being warm-blooded, or endothermic as mammals are, provides the distinct advantage of being able to maintain a consistent internal temperature independent of the surrounding environment, though it comes at a high metabolic cost. Being cold-blooded, or ectothermic, on the other hand, is a metabolic strategy in which an organism's internal body temperature varies with the surrounding environment, and while less energetically costly overall, it can limit an organism's ability to remain active and functional in cold or thermally variable environments. Terminids, however, are adaptable to a wide range of temperature conditions, from the scorching heat of desert planets to the freezing cold of icy worlds.
Could it be that the Terminid's planet of origin would shed some light on this adaptation?
What an excellent insight! I believe so. You see, prior to the First Galactic War, bugs, as Terminids were then known, were found on Kepler Prime, their homeworld. I hypothesize that the orbit of this planet is highly elliptical, meaning that at times it is scorchingly close to its sun, and at others, freezingly distant. It's actually yet another example of this species' extreme adaptability. Speaking of which, let's see if we can find another example of just how varied the Terminid truly is. Manta?
Oops, my apologies. I think the OmniGrab array has malfunctioned.
Not a problem at all. In fact, it just so happens that these two specimens are both examples of the very next cast I'd hoped to see, the Hunters. Specifically, we have the so-called Pouncer, a small and lightly built variety, and which appear to serve as scouts and frontline assault units. They're not as powerful as some we've seen so far, but they are incredibly agile, able to leap through the air, quickly closing the distance to their target before digging into them with their razor-sharp mandibles and forelimbs.
And are those wings, Doctor?
An excellent observation. Pouncers do possess lateral arrays of keratinous spines, between which stretches a highly flexible membrane, though they're not capable of true flight. Instead, once propelled upward by the leaping action of their powerful hind limbs, these wings allow the pouncer to glide for a short distance.
I'm reminded of a certain stage of the graboid life cycle we saw in an alternate version of Nevada.
I thought the same, and though they are certainly quite different in most other ways, their method of traversal is similar. And like the blaster, these are only one stage of a greater life cycle. You see, the other specimen we've abducted is what is known as the Hunter, and through a series of transformative molts that reshape their bodies and minds, it is what the Pouncer will become, if conditions require it. Like the Pouncer, the Hunter is fast and agile, but significantly larger, and with a thicker exoskeleton and a more muscular frame, though not nearly as much as some of the other casts we've seen. Indeed, rather than defensive adaptations, the role of the Hunter requires rapid movement and dexterity. And the Hunter is a striking example of just how advanced Terminid senses can be. In fact, Terminids have a highly developed sensory system with an array of specialized organs that allow them to navigate their environment and communicate with one another. Their compound eyes, though difficult to see, are somewhat similar to those of insects on Earth and provide excellent visual acuity and motion detection. Not only that, but Terminids possess a variety of chemosensory organs, such as sensory hairs that enable them to detect pheromones and other chemical signals.
Scans of all specimens also indicate the presence of chordotonal organs in their joints, which presumably allow the Terminids to detect and interpret environmental vibrations.
Astounding! As with insects and crustaceans on Earth, mechanoreceptors like these consist of clusters of sensory cells, each of which is associated with a small, flexible bristle or hair-like structure known as a scolopedium. When a vibration or other mechanical stimulus is transmitted through the ground, it causes the scolopedia to bend and flex, which in turn stimulates the sensory cells to which they are attached. Then, these cells generate electrical signals that are transmitted to the terminid's nervous system, where they are processed and interpreted as sensory information. It's even likely that terminids use vibrations to not only detect threats and food sources, but also as a non-verbal method of communication. In fact, if that is the case, it would indicate that this species is more intelligent than previously thought. Though the Super-Earth government has consistently portrayed the Terminids as mindless, hostile creatures that pose a threat to galactic peace and prosperity, given the Hunter's impressive tactical behavior, which includes advanced evasion techniques and even coordinated flanking maneuvers, they may be quite intelligent indeed. Sadly, that is not only likely, but probable. After all, a docile species of reduced intelligence is easier to farm for resources than even a semi-advanced society. Official statements and media outlets have downplayed or outright denied the Terminid's capacity for sapience, culture, and peaceful coexistence. The notion of a once thriving Terminid civilization has been systematically suppressed. But of course, even the best laid plans sometimes backfire, as we've seen on this very planet. In any case, if you happen to see a hunter in the wild, which is a very bad idea by the way, you'll have to watch out not only for their more accurate wing-aided pouncing tactics, but also for the rapid projection of a pair of deadly stylets. These are essentially hard and sharp mouthpart structures that extend from the anterior region of the head, at lengths nearly double that of the hunter's entire body. These terrifying appendages are composed primarily of the same chitin that makes up the hunter's exoskeleton, but while being flexible, it is much denser and harder than even the external cuticle. Worse, the stylets appear to exhibit a small channel that runs their length, connecting to a pair of internal glands, which are capable of delivering a venom-like caustic agent known as bile, causing limited paralysis and possibly death in any victim.
These things have venom now?
Well, sort of, although it is quite limited in effectiveness, at least in naturally occurring casts.
That sounds ominous.
So it does. Anyway, if you recall, we briefly discussed the unintended effects of Super-Earth's toxic defense mechanism, termicide. Here on Meridia, we established that the explosive population growth was due to mutations induced by the very neurotoxin designed to exterminate them. But that's not the only case of such a mutation. Recently, an entirely new Terminid form arose, and rather than scuttling along the ground or even gliding short distances, this creature was able to fly. Manta, see if you can bring one on board. As you can see, the Shrieker, as it is known, very closely resembles a hunter, but with a very notable difference. Can you spot it?
Are you referring to its gigantic wings?
Precisely. Here, the relatively small lateral extensions of both the Pouncer and Hunter have increased greatly, and have given this form the ability to fly. Now, how exactly this occurred is...
Let me guess. Yet another closely guarded secret.
Yes, exactly that. We can speculate, however, that the deployment of termicide in one or more populations, and likely specifically in the eggs of what would have normally become pouncers, inadvertently triggered a rapid evolutionary response in the species. Over time, these selective pressures would have led to the emergence of new adaptations, and in the case of the Shriekers, the ability to fly would have provided significant advantage in escaping the toxic effects of termicide. After all, airborne individuals could more easily disperse and avoid contaminated areas. This leads me to one of the most intriguing aspects of Shrieker biology: their unique nesting behavior. You see, while other terminids lay eggs in subterranean nursing chambers and usually embedded in their fungal substrate, Shriekers lay eggs in elevated nests. Can you guess what they're called?
Aerial nesting structures?
Shrieker nests. An apt name, I'd say. Now, this novel form of reproduction suggests that the same pressures that gave rise to Shriekers in the first place also affected every aspect of their life cycle. In short, the ability to fly likely necessitated the creation of a protective environment for the vulnerable eggs and developing larvae, while being accessible from the air. Speaking of flying, let's take a closer look at just how this creature accomplishes this impressive feat. After all, there's a little more to the process than simply making hunter or pouncer wings larger. You see, though both the pouncer and the hunter possess wing-like appendages, as we've seen, they are relatively rigid and really only useful for guided gliding. The modifications made by Super Earth on this strain, whether passive or intentional, appear to have included a complete restructuring of the muscular system used to support these appendages. In the specimen before us, scans reveal highly developed dorsal longitudinal muscles, which are responsible for the powerful downstroke of the wings. But that's not all. We also see enlarged dorsoventral musculature, which, as you might guess, are responsible for the wing's forceful upward motion. These are the primary drivers of flight, but we also observe that the apparent equivalents of the pleurosternal and tergopleural muscles are much more developed than those of the Shrieker's precursor stages, and are immensely useful for controlling the wing's angle and orientation, as well as stabilizing what we might consider the thorax at the wing's attachment point. Amazingly, in order to support the increased metabolic demands of flight, these creatures also exhibit a more elaborate tracheal system, with far more branching and larger overall surface area. The presence of connected interior air sacs, much like those seen in honeybees and mosquitoes on Earth, appear to further enhance the flow of oxygen throughout their system. But of course, the ability to fly also necessitated a complete change in the creature's behavior. And indeed, Shriekers typically travel in large swarms, attacking targets by, well...
dive bombing them to death?
Precisely. As with other castes, this level of coordination suggests a high level of social organization, communication, and intelligence. But the existence of Shriekers isn't the only evidence of Super Earth's genetic tampering. Far from it, in fact. This is because there is an entire caste of Terminids who exhibit abilities completely distinct from any other. I'm speaking, of course, of the Bile caste. As we've seen time and time again, when it came to Terminid farming, Super Earth would stop at little in order to maximize the production of element 710. Now, it is likely that the ability to produce the caustic substance known as bile already existed in this species, in certain groups at least. For example, we've already discussed the hunter's venom. It stands to reason that the biological pathways that produce this substance could have been magnified in order to produce much, much more. To be honest, we don't understand how this happened, or exactly what lineage gave rise to the bile caste in general. What we do know is that they are not natural. Manta, see if you can locate a member of this caste for further study. Ah, there we are. This is the Bile Spitter, as it is known, the smallest of its caste.
Why is it called the Bile Spitter?
Well, Manta, I'm glad you asked. You see, when alarmed or provoked, Bile Spitters release a stream of corrosive bile from their mouth, targeting any perceived threat. This behavior can slow down or incapacitate attackers, buying time for other Terminid castes to mount a more coordinated defense.
That is disconcerting.
Correct. Anyway, as you can see, perhaps their most distinctive feature is their enlarged abdomen, which has been modified to store large quantities of its corrosive agent. Within the abdomen, it appears that specialized glands are responsible for producing and secreting the bile, while in order to accommodate it, the surrounding exoskeleton has become so thin that it is virtually translucent. Now, it is believed that Bile Spitters originated from the scavenger caste, facilitated by the previously mentioned genetic manipulation. The specific genetic changes, though entirely hidden from our investigation, likely involved modifications to the digestive system, pre-existing venom production pathways, and abdominal morphology. It's unclear whether the production of bile was intentional or a very disastrous accident.
What is bile exactly?
An excellent question. In some earth-dwelling organisms, bile is an alkaline fluid produced by the liver that aids in digestion by emulsifying food and especially fats. The bile of Terminids is in some ways similar to this, though also completely different. It appears that Terminid bile is a complex mixture of organic compounds such as organic acids, which include formic acid, acetic acid, and a unique compound I call terminic acid.
Fantastic name, Doctor. I'm sure it will catch on.
Thank you. Together, these organic compounds are the primary reason that this bile is so corrosive. But there's more. Bile is rich in specialized enzymes that break down organic matter in ways similar to our own bile, and suggests that in natural castes, A similar substance could play a role in digestion. We'll need to study this substance in more detail, but suffice it to say that when it comes into contact with organic matter, it is highly damaging and painful. And that's what makes these creatures so dangerous to any who cross their paths, mostly Helldivers these days. You see, the Bile Spitter's abdomen possesses a specialized network of ducts and tubes that connect the bile storage reservoirs in the abdomen to the mouth parts. These ducts are lined with muscular tissue and are capable of peristaltic contractions, similar to the mechanism by which food is moved through the digestive system in many organisms. This creates a pumping action, actively transporting bile from the abdominal reservoirs to the oral cavity. In the oral cavity itself, the mouth parts have undergone significant modifications to facilitate the projection of bile. Scans reveal smaller glands here, where bile is kept in reserve by a series of valves and sphincters. Specialized muscles not only control the release of bile into the mouth, but also regulate the pressure and volume of the projected stream.
Do these functions serve any purpose other than as an attack or defense mechanism?
Another excellent question. Yes. In the wild, members of the bile caste have been observed to apply bile in order to dissolve hard rocks, making tunneling much easier. This could be yet another unintended consequence of Super Earth's tampering. Now, we can't move on without addressing one final fascinating aspect of the Bile Spitter's anatomy. When killed, individuals of this caste have been observed to, well, explode, launching their caustic bile into their surroundings, something like a biological grenade.
How is that possible?
Well, when it seems that all is lost, it appears that a series of events are triggered. First, it's important to note that Terminids are not immune to the corrosive effects of bile. Internally, this substance is housed within specialized reservoirs, isolated from their other organs and systems. But in a dire situation, the Bile Spitter consciously contracts its abdominal muscles, rupturing these internal partitions and allowing the bile to mix with its other bodily fluids. Then, as it comes in contact with these fluids, the bile appears to catalyze a series of exothermic chemical reactions which, in turn, generate a significant amount of heat and pressure, rapidly building to a critical point. Eventually, this pressure will exceed the structural integrity of the poor creature's exoskeleton, leading to a catastrophic rupture. Finally, upon exposure to the atmosphere, oxygen reacts further with this chemical soup, resulting in an explosive chain reaction. Amazingly, similar behavior is not without precedence on Earth. Colobopsis saundersi, for example, exhibits a form of defensive self-destruction called autophysis. When combat has taken a turn for the worse, this Malaysian ant will intentionally rupture its gaster, bursting its oversized mandibular glands in which is stored a sticky and corrosive secretion. As a result, this compound is sprayed out in all directions, immobilizing and damaging any nearby opponents.
That is both fascinating and disturbing. What is the common name of this insect?
The Malaysian exploding ant.
I don't know what I expected.
Now, as with many of the other castes we've seen, the Bile Spitter is only one stage of a greater life cycle. Manta, have we located the next? Manta, what's happening?
My apologies. The Omni-Grab array seems to have locked onto an unintended target.
Egads! This was not at all what I expected to see. It's even better. This, our dear traveler, is the colossal Bile Titan, and what appears to be the largest Terminid in existence. Thank goodness for the Omni-Grab array's patent-pending spatial compression system. To what can we owe this creature's astounding size? You guessed it, genetic tampering. And in this case, the purpose and result is clear. The larger the Terminid, the more element 710 that can be harvested from its decomposing exoskeleton. However, as is the case with so many of the genetic changes brought on by Super Earth scientists, the Bile Titan's gigantism likely had unintended consequences. After all, an increase in size puts a significant strain on the creature's physiological systems, requiring more resources to sustain its metabolic needs. The energy and resource demands of maintaining such a large body size likely limits their numbers within Terminid colonies, and would explain why they are relatively rare, even compared to other members of the bile caste. Speaking of which, like others in its caste, this creature does possess bile, but it appears that the Titan's is particularly potent and destructive. I believe this to be for two reasons. First and most obvious, the Titan's massive size allows it to store and produce a significantly larger volume of bile compared to other bile Terminids. This increased volume alone contributes to the overall corrosive potential of its bile attacks. But scans also indicate that the Titan's bile glands have been modified to produce a more concentrated and refined form of bile. one that contains higher levels of corrosive compounds like the terminic acid and other enzymes we saw before, resulting in a far more potent and destructive substance. The Titan's larger size also means larger muscles, which in turn means that the bile can be projected farther, and with even more devastating force. In fact, given their size, Titans in general possess an incredibly robust musculature system, particularly in the legs, in which dense muscle fibers allow them to support their immense frame, while also being capable of surprising bursts of speed. But beyond their raw destructive power while living, Bile Titan's musculature leads to another interesting phenomenon upon death: violent, spontaneous post-mortem twitching. Indeed, these muscle twitches can be quite forceful given the sheer size and strength of the Bile Titan's legs. When an unsuspecting Helldiver comes into contact with the twitching leg of a fallen Bile Titan, it can result in a surprising and potentially hazardous interaction. Of course, post-mortem twitches are not unique to this cast or even this species, but the Titan certainly provides an impressive example. Whew, what a compelling specimen that was. But alas, our dear traveler, our time on Meridia, and also in this dimension, has come to an end. Tragically, we must refuel, and Manta most certainly does not run on element 710. Manta, please chart a course for the subject of our next study. Until next time, our dear traveler, feel free to take a brief respite. When you're ready, tap here to begin our next adventure.
Brace yourselves. Beginning ascent in 3, 2, 1.